You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. I never believed in angels. Not in the Sunday school kind, anyway. Not in halos and harps or divine interventions. I believed in dark places and darker men. I believed in shadows that moved on their own and the places where even silence had weight. That was enough to get me this job. My name's Dominic Grae. I used to run a maximum security prison in the Nevada desert. When I left, they told me I'd never find a place that needed me more than that one. They were wrong. 23 years I spent watching the worst humanity had to offer destroy themselves and everyone around them. 23 years of riots, stabbings, suicides, and slow psychological deterioration. I thought I understood evil. I thought I knew what it meant to cage monsters. The desert facility housed the most dangerous criminals in the American prison system. Murderers, terrorists, men whose names made headlines for all the wrong reasons. I was good at my job because I wasn't afraid of them. I understood that some people were simply broken beyond repair, and my duty was to make sure they never hurt anyone else again. But after 2 decades of that darkness, something in me cracked. Maybe it was watching too many men die behind those walls. Maybe it was the way the desert heat seemed to bake the humanity out of everyone who worked there. Or maybe it was the realization that I was becoming as hard and cold as the concrete that surrounded us every day. I submitted my resignation on a Wednesday morning and walked out into the Nevada sun for the last time, thinking I was done with the business of caging monsters forever. The invitation came in the form of a letter, handwritten, sealed with red wax, and delivered by a man in a long coat who didn't blink once during our 2-minute conversation. The job: Warden of a classified Vatican facility somewhere in the Dolomite Mountains. The pay: enough to make me forget every promise I made to never return to the business of caging things. The stranger who delivered it was tall, pale, with fingers that seemed too long for his hands. When I asked him how he'd found me, he simply said, "We find who we need when we need them." His voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, something European but older somehow. When I pressed for details about the position, he handed me a business card with nothing but a phone number and walked away. I never saw him get into a car or even heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. I should have known better, but after 20 years of watching men destroy each other behind concrete walls, I needed something different. Something that would make sense of all the darkness I'd witnessed. The stranger left without another word, and I found myself packing that same night. Something about the letter compelled me in a way I couldn't explain. The Vatican seal looked authentic. The paper felt expensive and old, and the handwriting was beautiful in a way that suggested education and refinement. Most importantly, it offered purpose again. I'd been drifting for 6 months since leaving Nevada, drinking too much, sleeping too little, haunted by dreams of concrete corridors and the screams of men pushed beyond their breaking point. The journey to Italy felt like stepping through a veil. First Rome, where I was met by another stranger, this one wearing priest's robes and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. He asked no questions about my background or qualifications, simply handed me travel documents and led me to a waiting helicopter. The pilot was different from any Vatican personnel I might have expected. He wore military fatigues with no identifying patches, and his hands shook slightly as he performed the pre-flight checks. As we lifted off and headed into mountain territory, where maps seemed to lose their meaning, I tried to make conversation. How long have you been flying for the church? I asked. He glanced back at me, eyes wide with something that might have been fear. This is my first time to Il Cavo, he said. They told me it would probably be my last. What's that supposed to mean? But he didn't answer. Instead, he crossed himself 3 times as we descended towards what looked like an abandoned monastery, perched on a cliff face that shouldn't have been able to support such a structure. The stones were dark, almost black, and seemed to absorb the late afternoon sunlight rather than reflect it. As we approached, I could see that many of the windows were bricked up, and those that remained were covered with iron bars that looked like they'd been forged centuries ago. I arrived just after nightfall. The entrance was through an old church, stone bones and rotting pews, stained glass windows that looked melted by some ancient heat. The images in the glass were biblical scenes, but they'd been distorted somehow. Angels with too many eyes, saints with expressions of terror rather than beatitude, and in the center, a depiction of the fall of Lucifer that made my skin crawl. The air smelled of incense and ash, but below it was something else, something deeper. A scent like copper and ozone, like the moments before a lightning strike. They called it Il Cavo, the Hollow. An elderly priest named Father Benedetto met me at the altar. His hands shook constantly, and I noticed that his fingernails were bitten down to the quick. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he didn't sleep well, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much. "Warden Grae," he said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "We've been waiting for you. The position has been vacant for 3 months now." What happened to my predecessor? Father Benedetto's eyes darted toward the shadows at the back of the church. Warden Morrison completed his service, as they all do, eventually. He led me to a section of floor that opened like a mouth when he pressed certain stones in sequence. The mechanism was ancient but well maintained, moving with the smooth precision of something that had been used regularly for centuries. The elevator, it was ancient iron, rattling and moaning with each level we passed. A Swiss guard, named Captain Torres, helmet gleaming in the dim light, recited Latin prayers under his breath beside me. Unlike the other Vatican personnel I'd met, he seemed genuinely glad to see me. "You have experience with difficult prisoners?" he asked as we descended. 23 years worth, I replied. "Good. You'll need every bit of that experience down here. These aren't ordinary criminals." "What are they?" Captain Torres exchanged a glance with Father Benedetto. "You'll see soon enough, but understand this. Everything you thought you knew about the nature of evil, about what's possible in this world, you'll need to forget it. The rules are different here." We dropped for nearly 5 minutes, passing level after level marked with Roman numerals carved into the stone. The descent felt like travelling back through time itself, each level taking us deeper into something ancient and primal. When the doors finally opened, I understood why they buried this place so deep. The prison was built like a cathedral turned inside out. Obsidian stone stretched in arched ceilings above us, while intricate iron designs were etched into the floors beneath our feet. The workmanship was extraordinary, clearly the product of master craftsmen working with unlimited resources and infinite patience. Light came from oil sconces and chandeliers of cold flame that gave off no warmth. There were no windows. Time didn't pass the same down here. Father Benedetto's voice echoed strangely in the vast space, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "Welcome to Il Cavo, Warden Grae. This facility has operated continuously for over 800 years. You are the 47th warden to accept this position." "What happened to the others?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer would trouble me. He paused at the threshold of the main corridor, and I noticed that his breathing had become laboured. They fulfilled their purpose. Each served until their time came to pass the responsibility to another. "How long do wardens typically serve?" It varies. Some lasted only a few years, others. He gestured towards a bronze plaque mounted on the wall, inscribed with names and dates. The longest was Warden Castellani. He served for 87 years. I studied the plaque more closely. The dates didn't make sense. According to the inscription, Castellani had begun his service in 1823 and ended it in 1910. That would have made him well over 100 years old. There must be some mistake in the records. Father Benedetto shook his head slowly. No mistake. Time moves differently here, Warden Grae. The presence of the prisoners affects everything. Perception, aging, the passage of days and nights. You'll understand eventually. Each cell had no bars, just thick, blessed iron doors, marked with religious engravings I couldn't name. The metalwork was beautiful and terrible, depicting scenes of judgment and redemption that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. 10 of them. 10 cells. 9 occupants and one that had stood empty for over a century. They called them the Caduti, the Fallen. Captain Torres handed me a set of keys unlike anything I'd ever seen. Each one was unique, crafted from different metals and inscribed with various religious symbols. These are the only keys that exist, he said. They were forged by Pope Gregory IX himself, blessed with relics of saints and tempered in holy water from the Jordan River. Never let them out of your sight. What exactly am I guarding? Father Benedetto and Captain Torres exchanged another look, this one heavier with unspoken meaning. Come, the priest said finally, let me introduce you to your charges. They weren't demons. Demons can be killed. These were something else. Once angels, now twisted, bound in flesh they couldn't shed, eyes glowing like furnace coals, voices like wind through broken bone. They didn't speak often, but when they did, it wasn't in any human tongue. Yet somehow I understood every word. The first cell contained something that had once been beautiful beyond human comprehension. Even in its fallen state, traces of that divine beauty remained, making it all the more terrible to behold. It looked like a man, but stretched taller than it should have been, wings blackened and barbed, hands with too many joints. When it moved, which was rarely, it did so with a grace that spoke of eons spent in the presence of the divine. Father Benedetto approached the observation slot carefully. This is Azazel, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. According to the Book of Enoch, he taught humanity the arts of war and cosmetics. He has been here since the facility's founding. I peered through the slot and immediately understood why the priest spoke so quietly. The thing stood perfectly still in the center of its cell, eyes locked on me through the opening. My breath frosted instantly in the warm corridor, and I felt a pressure in my chest like diving too deep too fast. The creature smiled, revealing teeth like broken diamonds, and when it spoke, the words bypassed my ears entirely and appeared directly in my mind. Dominic Grae, it said without moving its lips. The last warden. We have been waiting for you for such a long time. I stepped back from the door, heart hammering. How does it know my name? They know many things they shouldn't, Captain Torres replied grimly. That's part of what makes them so dangerous. The second cell housed something that sang constantly, melodies that scraped the edge of memory and made guards weep or claw at their ears until they bled. Brother Alessandro, the head guard, who'd been here 15 years, warned me never to listen for more than a few seconds at a time. He was a short, stocky man, with prematurely grey hair and hands that never stopped trembling. I made the mistake of listening for too long during my first week, he confided as we moved past the door. Even with thick iron between us and the prisoner, I could hear the faint strains of its song. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but underneath it was something that made my spine crawl. I stood there for nearly an hour, completely transfixed. When they finally pulled me away, I'd bitten through my tongue and clawed gouges in my arms without realizing it. What is it singing about? The music of the spheres, Father Benedetto answered. The song of creation itself, but corrupted, twisted into something that drives mortal minds to madness. This one was called Kokabiel in the old texts. It taught humanity the secrets of astronomy and astrology. Cell 3 contained what they called the Scratcher. It etched marks into its stone walls every hour, on the hour, without ever appearing to move. The stone cracked each time like bone under pressure, and over the centuries the walls had become covered in an intricate pattern of scratches and gouges. Dr. Helena Cross, the Vatican psychologist assigned to study the prisoners, had spent years trying to understand what drove this behaviour. Dr. Cross was a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and prematurely silver hair. She'd been at Il Cavo for 10 years, longer than anyone except Brother Alessandro and Father Benedetto. When I asked about her background, she explained that she'd been recruited from Cambridge, where she'd been studying religious psychology and the effects of extreme isolation on the human mind. The scratching isn't random, she told me, as we stood before cell 3. There's a compulsion to it, but the purpose isn't clear. Every mark is deliberate, placed with surgical precision. I believe it's trying to carve something, a map perhaps, or a message, but after all these centuries, we're no closer to understanding what... Have you asked the prisoner? She gave me a look that was equal parts amusement and horror. Once. I spent 3 days in the medical wing afterward, recovering from what the doctors called acute psychological trauma. I don't recommend attempting communication with any of them until you've been here much longer. Cell 4 housed one of the most disturbing prisoners. It refused to face the door. Ever. The guards called it the Mourner, and they said if it ever turned around the world would forget the sun. It stood with its back to us, perfectly motionless, wings wrapped around itself like a burial shroud. When I laughed at their superstition, Brother Alessandro's face went pale. Has it ever turned around? I asked. Once, he replied, his voice tight with remembered terror. In 1347, 3 guards were on duty that night. They all went blind instantly, but before they lost their sight, they reported that the stars disappeared from the sky outside. They didn't return for 3 days. That's impossible. Is it? Father Benedetto asked. The Black Death began that same year. Coincidence? He gestured toward the motionless figure. This one was called Shamsiel in the texts. It was responsible for the signs of the sun. The 5th cell contained something they called the Whisperer. Unlike the others, this one actively tried to communicate with the guards, speaking in dozens of different languages, some of which predated recorded history. It knew personal details about everyone who worked in the facility, childhood memories, secret fears, the names of loved ones who had died. Dr. Cross theorized that it could read thoughts, but Father Benedetto believed it had access to knowledge that transcended normal human understanding. It told me about my daughter's first word, Captain Torres confided as we passed its cell. My daughter who died in infancy, 3 years before I was even assigned here. It described the dress my wife was wearing when it happened, the colour of the walls in our apartment, even the weather that day. Details I'd never told anyone. This one was Gadriel, Father Benedetto explained. According to scripture, it was responsible for leading Eve astray in the Garden of Eden. It knows the secrets of human hearts. Cell 6 held the tempter. It appeared as whatever the observer most desired. A lost love, a deceased family member, a childhood friend. The illusion was perfect in every detail, and many guards had been driven to madness by its false promises of reunion with those they'd lost. Brother Alessandro had installed a special mirror system that allowed observation without direct eye contact, but even the reflection was dangerous to watch for too long. "What does it look like to you?" Dr. Cross asked as I peered into the mirror. I saw my father, who died when I was 12. He looked exactly as he had in life. Tall, weathered from years of construction work, with kind eyes and calloused hands. He was reaching towards the observation slot, mouth moving as if speaking, but no sound emerged. The sight hit me like a physical blow, and I had to step away from the mirror. "Everyone sees someone different," Dr. Cross observed, "but it's always someone you've lost, someone you do anything to see again. The texts call this one Samyaza, the leader of the 200 angels who fell for the beauty of human women." Cell 7 had been empty for over 100 years. Sealed, sanctified, left untouched. No record of who or what had once been inside. The door was different from the others, heavier, with additional locks and religious inscriptions that covered every inch of its surface. When I asked about it, Father Benedetto's face went pale. "We don't speak of Cell 7, he said firmly. "It remains empty by papal decree. Whatever was once contained there must never be allowed to return." "But what was it?" "Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, Warden Grae. The records were sealed and hidden for good reason. All I can tell you is that it was the first one captured, and the most powerful. When it was finally removed from that cell, it took the combined prayers of 50 cardinals and the Pope himself to contain the spiritual damage. Cell 8 housed something they called the Prophet. It spoke constantly of future events, but its predictions were always disasters. Wars, plagues, natural catastrophes. The terrible thing was that its prophecies always came true, usually within a few months of being spoken. The Vatican had learned to pay close attention to its utterances, sometimes managing to mitigate the worst effects of predicted tragedies. "This one was Barachiel," Father Benedetto explained as we passed its cell. "It taught humanity the secrets of lightning and weather. Its knowledge of future events comes from understanding the patterns of the natural world." Cell 9, the final occupied cell, held something they simply called the Destroyer. According to Father Benedetto, it was responsible for teaching humanity the arts of war and violence. It rarely spoke, but when it did, its words carried such force that the stones themselves cracked. Dr. Cross had measured seismic activity whenever it became agitated, small earthquakes that emanated from its cell and spread throughout the facility. "Azrael," Father Benedetto whispered as we approached, "the angel of death. Even among the fallen, this one is feared." The facility operated on a strict schedule that had been refined over centuries of trial and error. Feeding time was dawn and dusk, always in pairs, never alone. The prisoners didn't require food in any biological sense, but they needed to consume something. Hope, faith, memories, souls. The feeding ritual involved a complex ceremony performed by Father Benedetto, during which each prisoner was offered a communion wafer that had been specially blessed by the Pope himself. Dr. Cross explained the feeding process during my first week briefing. "They don't eat the wafers," she said. "They absorb something from them, some spiritual essence that keeps them stable. Without it, they become agitated, and their abilities intensify. We learned that the hard way in 1823, when a supply shortage led to 3 days without feeding. 2 guards died, and the facility itself nearly collapsed." "What do you mean the facility nearly collapsed?" "The building began to phase in and out of reality," Father Benedetto interjected. "Walls became transparent, gravity stopped working properly, and time began flowing backward in certain sections. It took a blessing from Pope Leo XIV himself to stabilize the situation." Brother Alessandro nodded grimly. "I've been here 15 years, and I still don't understand half of what I've seen. The prisoners affect everything around them. Technology fails, compasses spin wildly, and clocks run at different speeds depending on which corridor you're in. The longer you work here, the harder it becomes to remember what normal life was like. As the days passed, I began to understand what he meant. There was something about the facility that drained hope from everyone within its walls. Guards would arrive cheerful and optimistic, but within weeks they'd become withdrawn and morose. The suicide rate among staff was astronomical, which explained why most positions were rotated every few months. But there were other effects too. I noticed that my hair was growing more slowly than normal, and cuts healed faster than they should have. Dr. Cross confirmed that everyone experienced similar changes. The presence of the prisoners affects biological processes, she explained. Aging slows dramatically while you're here. Some of the long-term staff have been here for decades, but barely look older than when they arrived. Is that why Father Benedetto and Brother Alessandro have stayed so long? Partly. But there's another factor. The longer you're here, the more you become attuned to the spiritual energy of the place. Eventually you reach a point where you can't leave. The outside world becomes painful, overwhelming. You become bound to this place in ways that go beyond any employment contract. It was during my 3rd week that the whispers began. Not voices I could hear with my ears, but thoughts that appeared in my mind unbidden. They spoke of ancient days when angels walked among men, of the glory that was lost when they fell, of the loneliness of eternal imprisonment. At first I dismissed them as products of stress and isolation, but as they grew stronger and more frequent, I began to suspect their true source. The prisoners were calling to me. Dr. Cross noticed the change during one of our regular psychological evaluations. "You're showing signs of what we call integration," she said, studying my responses to various tests. "It happens to everyone eventually, but usually not this quickly. Most wardens take months to develop this level of sensitivity to the prisoner's influence." "What does it mean?" "That you're becoming part of the facility's spiritual ecosystem. The barriers between your mind and theirs are weakening. It's not necessarily dangerous, but it does mean you'll need to be more careful about maintaining psychological boundaries." But even as she spoke, I could feel those boundaries continuing to erode. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I began to understand things I shouldn't have known. The true names of the prisoners, the reasons for their fall, the cosmic significance of their imprisonment. Knowledge flowed into my mind like water through a broken dam, threatening to wash away everything that made me human. It was during my 4th week that Cell 7 began to stir. I first noticed it during my midnight rounds. The temperature in the corridor had dropped noticeably, and frost was forming on the iron door despite the facility's constant warmth. When I peered through the observation slot, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The cell wasn't empty. A shadow stood in the center of the room, tall and imposing, wearing what looked like a crown of rusted bone. It had no clear features, existing more as an absence of light than a physical presence, but I could feel its attention focused on me with terrifying intensity. I called for Father Benedetto immediately, and when he arrived his face went white at my description. "That's impossible," he muttered, but his hands were shaking as he fumbled with his keys. Cell 7 has been empty for over a century. The wards were renewed just last year. But when we looked together, the shadow was gone. The cell appeared empty once more, showing no sign that anything had ever been there. Father Benedetto insisted that I must have been seeing things, that the stress of the job was affecting my perception, but I knew what I had seen. That night, one of the guards was found in the chapel room, eyes gone, tongue nailed to the altar. No blood, just scripture carved into the flesh of his back, in a language none of us could read. The man was alive but couldn't speak, couldn't see, could only make sounds like wind through empty halls. Dr. Cross sedated him, but even unconscious, he continued to make those terrible, hollow sounds. I studied the markings on his back with a magnifying glass. The carving was precise, done with surgical skill, but the language was completely foreign. Have you seen writing like this before? I asked Dr. Cross. Once, she replied quietly, in the restricted archives. It's Enochian, the language supposedly used by angels to communicate with each other. But this particular passage, she consulted a reference book with trembling hands. It's a summoning. Something is calling the prisoners home. Cardinal Torretti arrived the next morning with a team of Vatican investigators. He was a man in his 60s who'd spent his entire career dealing with the church's most closely guarded secrets. Within an hour of examining Cell 7, he was requesting immediate evacuation. The containment has been compromised, he announced during an emergency meeting. Something is actively working to free the prisoners, and we may not be able to stop it. What do you recommend? Father Benedetto asked. Seal the facility, collapse the tunnels, bury it so deep that nothing can ever escape. What about the staff? Cardinal Torretti's expression was grim. The church will remember your sacrifice. But before any evacuation could be organised, the cardinal was found in his quarters the next morning, screaming about visions of burning cities and falling stars. Dr. Cross examined him and declared that he was suffering from what she called prophetic overload. His mind had been flooded with visions of possible futures, most of them apocalyptic. More guards arrived that evening, elite Swiss guards who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Captain Torres tried to brief them, but even these hardened veterans seemed unnerved by the facility's atmosphere. The prisoners had become more active too, their voices carrying further. Their presence felt more strongly throughout the corridors. The balance is shifting, Dr. Cross told me privately. Something's changed. In all my years here, the prisoners have never shown this level of anticipation. They're excited about something. That's when it began calling to me directly. Not whispers this time, but a voice as clear as spoken words, though it came from inside my own mind. The voice spoke of destiny, of purpose, of the role I was meant to play in events that had been set in motion centuries ago. You are the 47th Warden, it said during one particularly vivid episode. The last in a line that stretches back to the founding of this place. Your predecessors served their time and passed on the responsibility. But you, Dominic Grae, you are different. You are the one who will stay. I tried to ignore the voice, to focus on my duties and maintain some semblance of normalcy. But sleep became elusive, and when I did manage to rest, my dreams were filled with visions of ancient wars between angels and demons, of cosmic battles fought across dimensions I couldn't comprehend. I began to understand the true significance of the facility, the cosmic importance of keeping these beings contained. Dr. Cross found me in the corridor at 3 a.m, staring at Cell 7's door. The frost had returned, spreading across the walls in intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. Dominic, she said gently, you need to step away from that door. Whatever's in there, it's affecting you more than the others. They said I was chosen, I replied, not taking my eyes off the door. All of this, my entire life, it was preparation for this moment. Chosen by who? I couldn't answer. The voice in my head whispered, you are the last Warden, the one who will not pass on the keys. Come on, Dr. Cross said, taking my arm. Let's get you some coffee and talk about this. But as we walked away, I heard something that made me stop. A sound like stone grinding against stone, followed by the unmistakable creak of ancient hinges. I turned back to see Cell 7's door standing slightly ajar, darkness spilling out like liquid shadow. The facility's alarm should have sounded. Emergency protocols should have engaged. But instead there was only silence, as if the very air had frozen in anticipation of what was about to emerge. I found the Vatican's hidden archives the next night, when sleep proved impossible, and the whispers in my mind had grown too loud to ignore. The entrance was behind the confessional in the chapel, concealed by a mechanism that required pressing certain stones in a specific sequence, a sequence that appeared in my mind as if I'd always known it. The chamber beyond was small but packed with treasures that represented centuries of forbidden knowledge. Books bound in leather that looked disturbingly organic, their pages filled with text in dozens of ancient languages. Maps of celestial realms that shouldn't exist, showing the positions of stars and planets that weren't part of our reality. Artifacts that hummed with barely contained power. Chalices, reliquaries, weapons that had been blessed by long-dead saints. But it was the journals that drew my attention. Hundreds of them, dating back to the 4th century, each one written by a different warden of Il Cavo. The earliest entries described the capture of the first prisoners, the ones who would eventually be contained in cells 1 through 9. But it was the more recent journals that held the key to understanding my situation. Every warden had served until they either died or simply disappeared from the records. But the pattern was clear. As the centuries passed, the terms of service had grown longer. The first warden served only a few years before requesting transfer. By the Renaissance, terms had stretched to decades, and in recent centuries, wardens had begun to serve until death, their bodies found in their quarters with expressions of peaceful acceptance. But there was one journal that stood apart from the others, written in a hand I somehow recognized. The final entry was dated just 3 months ago, Warden Morrison's last words before his own disappearance. "I understand now," he had written. "The position was never temporary. There has always been one who stays, one who becomes part of the containment itself. The prisoners cannot be truly contained by human will alone. They require a sacrifice, a willing soul to anchor them to this reality. I go now to take my place in cell 7, to become the lock that keeps them all bound. May God forgive me for what I must become." The truth hit me like a physical blow. Cell 7 hadn't been empty for a century. It had been waiting for each warden in turn to complete their service, to take their place as the final guardian who would never leave. And now it was my turn. As I sat in that hidden chamber, surrounded by the accumulated secrets of 8 centuries, I felt the last of my human resistance crumble. The voice in my mind was no longer alien or intrusive. It was my own voice, speaking truths I had always known but never acknowledged. I was the last warden, the one who would not pass on the keys. It happened last night. I was making my final rounds when every light in the facility went out simultaneously. Emergency power kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Then the doors began to open. Not just cell 7, but all of them. One by one, the thick iron barriers swung wide with sounds like the tolling of funeral bells. But the prisoners didn't emerge to escape. They came out to witness. Azazel was the first to appear in the corridor, his massive form moving with impossible grace. The others followed. The singer with its voice like broken music. The scratcher with its compulsive movements. The mourner still refusing to turn around. All of them gathering in the central chamber, like a congregation awaiting a sermon. And from cell 7 came something that made them all seem small by comparison. It wore the shape of a man, but stretched and elongated until it towered nearly 10 feet tall. Its skin was like polished obsidian, and its wings were vast shadows that seemed to absorb light itself. But it was the crown that commanded attention, a circlet of rusted bone and twisted metal that sat upon its brow like a mockery of divine authority. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of worlds ending. "Dominic Grae, 47th Warden of Il Cavo. You have served well, but your true service is about to begin." I should have been terrified. I should have run, called for help, activated emergency protocols. But instead I felt only a deep sense of recognition, as if I was finally meeting someone I'd known my entire life. "You're Morrison," I said, and it wasn't a question. The thing that had once been my predecessor nodded slowly. Now I'm the guardian, the lock that keeps the others bound to this reality, and soon you will join me. Dr. Cross and Father Benedetto found us in the central chamber, the 9 fallen angels arranged in a circle around Morrison and myself. Dr. Cross started toward me, but Father Benedetto held her back. "It's too late," the old priest said, tears streaming down his face. "The transformation has already begun. Look at his eyes." I caught my reflection in the polished surface of Morrison's obsidian skin and saw that Father Benedetto was right. My eyes had begun to glow with the same inner fire that burned in the prisoners. My humanity was slipping away, replaced by something older and more terrible. "Dominic, fight this," Dr. Cross pleaded. "You don't have to accept what they're offering." But I could feel the truth burning through my veins like molten gold. This wasn't an offering. It was a completion. Every choice I'd made, every path I'd taken, had led me to this moment. The 23 years in Nevada hadn't been preparation for containing human monsters. They'd been training for containing divine ones. "The position was never temporary," I said, my voice already beginning to change, taking on harmonics that human throats weren't meant to produce. "There's always been one who stays, one who becomes the anchor that keeps them all bound." Morrison stepped closer, and I could see the intelligence burning behind his transformed features. He was still human enough to remember what he'd given up, still conscious enough to understand the magnitude of his sacrifice. "The world above must never know what we guard here," he said. "They couldn't comprehend the forces we hold in check. But you understand, don't you, Dominic? You've always understood that some sacrifices are necessary to protect others." I did understand. Just as I'd given up pieces of my humanity to run the Nevada facility, just as I'd hardened my heart to do what needed to be done, now I would give up my humanity entirely to serve a greater purpose. The transformation was beginning in earnest now. I could feel my bones lengthening, my skin taking on a darker hue. Wings were pushing through my shoulder blades, not the white feathered wings of church depictions, but wings of shadow and starlight. The pain was indescribable, but beneath it was a joy so profound it brought tears to my changing eyes. "Will it hurt?" I asked Morrison. "Only until you let go of what you were," he replied. "Then you'll understand what you were always meant to become." Dr. Cross was backing toward the emergency exit, her face pale with shock and grief. "I'll report what happened here," she said. "I'll make sure they send someone else." "They will," I agreed, my voice now carrying the same otherworldly harmonics as Morrison's. "The cycle must continue. There must always be a warden, and there must always be one who stays to ensure the others never escape." The 9 fallen angels began to sing then, their voices joining in a harmony that made the stone walls themselves resonate. It wasn't the maddening song I'd heard from the singer's cell, but something else entirely, a hymn of welcome, of recognition, of ancient purpose finally fulfilled. I felt my consciousness expanding beyond the confines of human perception. I could see the facility as it truly was, not just a prison, but a spiritual fortress standing against forces that would unmake reality itself. The fallen angels weren't the enemy. They were the ammunition, their combined spiritual energy creating a barrier that kept much worse things from breaking through into our world. And I was about to become the gunpowder that made the cannon fire. "The world is changing," Morrison explained as my transformation accelerated. "The barriers between realities are weakening. Ancient things are stirring in dimensions we can barely comprehend. The Vatican knows this, has always known it, that's why they built this place. Not to punish the fallen, but to use their power to protect humanity from things that would make them look like children's toys." I understood now why the Warden's terms of service had grown longer over the centuries. The threats were increasing, the barriers weakening, and more power was needed to maintain the defenses. Each Warden who stayed and transformed added their strength to the spiritual fortress, making it capable of withstanding greater assaults. "How many others are there?" I asked, thinking of the other Vatican installations Morrison had mentioned. 47 facilities worldwide, he replied, each one anchored by a transformed Warden, each one guarding a different weak point in reality's fabric. We are the guardians that humanity never knows it needs. My wings were fully formed now, stretching 15 feet from tip to tip. They were beautiful in their terrible darkness, covered in patterns that shifted and changed when observed directly. My hands had elongated, fingers ending in claws that could rend both flesh and spirit. And my eyes, I could see everything now. Past, present, future, all layered together like transparent images stacked one atop another. I saw the construction of Il Cavo 8 centuries ago, Pope Innocent IV himself blessing the foundations. I saw the first fallen angel dragged screaming into its cell, its divine power immediately repurposed to strengthen reality's walls. I saw the long line of wardens who had served and eventually taken their places as eternal guardians. And I saw the future too. Dark times were coming. Things moved in the spaces between stars, ancient hungers that had waited eons for the barriers to weaken enough for them to break through. Wars would be fought not with bullets and bombs, but with prayers and sacrifices, with the willing souls of those brave enough to stand guard in the dark places. Father Benedetto approached slowly, his weathered face streaked with tears. "Forgive us, my son," he whispered. "Forgive us for the deception. We could never tell you the truth from the beginning. No one would accept this burden willingly if they knew what it truly entailed." "I'm not angry, Father," I said, surprised to realize it was true. My voice had changed completely now, carrying harmonics that made the air itself shiver. "I understand why the deception was necessary. Someone has to guard the gates. Someone has to pay the price. And I've always been willing to sacrifice myself to protect others. The transformation was nearing completion. I could feel my human memories becoming distant, less important. What mattered now was the work, the eternal vigilance, the constant reinforcement of barriers that kept unthinkable horrors from devouring everything I had once held dear. Dr. Cross had reached the emergency exit, but she turned back one last time. "Will I ever see you again, the real you?" I considered the question, drawing on knowledge that was no longer quite human. "In a sense, you'll see me every time you enter this facility. I'll be part of its walls, part of its spirit, part of the consciousness that keeps the barriers strong. But the man you knew as Dominic Grae is ending. What I'm becoming is something new." She nodded, understanding passing between us like a current of electricity. Then she was gone, disappeared through the hidden passage that would carry her back to the surface world, back to sunlight and normal time, and the comfortable illusion that reality was a simple, predictable thing. I was alone with Morrison and the 9 fallen angels, who would soon be my eternal companions. They formed a circle around me as the final changes took hold, welcoming me into their brotherhood of guardians who had traded their humanity for cosmic purpose. "What happens now?" I asked Morrison. "Now we take our positions," he replied. "You will occupy cell 7 as I did before you. The cell will reshape itself to accommodate your new form, becoming both your prison and your throne. From there, you will help maintain the barriers, channeling your power through the facility's spiritual architecture to keep the darkness at bay." "And the others?" "They return to their cells willingly, as they always have. They understand the importance of the work, just as you do now. The fallen angels were never our prisoners, Dominic. They were our partners, willing volunteers in humanity's defense against cosmic horror." The revelation was staggering, but it felt right in a way I couldn't explain. The beings I'd thought were contained against their will were actually choosing to remain, lending their power to the barrier system that protected the world from entities that made them look benevolent by comparison. I felt myself moving towards cell 7, though I couldn't tell if I was walking or floating. The heavy iron door swung open at my approach, revealing a chamber that was already beginning to transform. The walls expanded. The ceiling rose to accommodate my new height, and patterns of light began to flow beneath the stone, like veins carrying liquid starlight. As I crossed the threshold, I felt the full weight of my new responsibilities settle upon me. Through mystical senses I hadn't possessed as a human, I could perceive the vast network of barriers that surrounded our reality. They were beautiful and terrible, gossamer-thin walls between dimensions that required constant maintenance and reinforcement. And beyond those walls, I could sense the things that pressed against them. Ancient hungers older than galaxies, entities that existed in states of being that had no names in any human language. They had been waiting for eons, testing the barriers, seeking any weakness that might allow them entry into our fragile reality. But they would not pass, not while we stood guard, not while the Guardians maintained their eternal vigil. The door of Cell 7 began to close behind me, but I felt no sense of confinement. This wasn't a prison. It was a command center, a nexus point where cosmic forces could be focused and directed. From here, I could monitor the entire dimensional matrix, sensing any fluctuations or weak points that might require reinforcement. Morrison appeared beside me as the transformation completed itself. He no longer seemed alien or frightening. Instead, he looked like what he truly was, a fellow Guardian who had made the same choice I was making, a comrade in arms in the longest war ever fought. "Welcome to the Watch, Brother Dominic," he said, using my human name. "One last time. What will you call yourself now?" I considered the question, drawing on knowledge that spanned eons. "Raguel," I said finally, "the vengeance of God, the angel who brings justice to those who transgress against divine law." He nodded approvingly. "A good choice, and now, Raguel, we must begin the work. The barriers have been weakened by my transformation, and they require immediate attention." I reached out with senses that operated beyond the physical realm, feeling for the weak points in reality's fabric. There, a spot near the Antarctic facility where something had been pressing particularly hard. I channeled power through the facility's spiritual architecture, reinforcing the barrier with my own essence. The sensation was indescribable. It was like being connected to every Guardian in every facility around the world, all of us working together to maintain the defenses that kept humanity safe. I could sense my brothers and sisters in their own cells, feel their strength adding to mine, their willpower combining with my own to hold the line against chaos. Time moved differently now. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days, days like years. I watched through mystical perception as Dr. Cross made a report to the Vatican, carefully editing the truth to make it palatable for human minds. I observed as they began the process of selecting my replacement, another experienced Warden, whose life had prepared him for the ultimate sacrifice. I saw the letter being written, the red wax being heated for the seal. Somewhere in the world, another man who had spent his life containing monsters was about to receive an invitation he wouldn't be able to refuse. The cycle would continue, as it had for 8 centuries, as it would for 8 centuries more. But something had changed with my transformation. The barriers were stronger now than they had been in decades. My addition to the network of Guardians had reinforced weak points that had been growing dangerous, pushed back threats that had been pressing too close to breakthrough. The facility hummed with renewed power, and I could feel the satisfaction of my fellow Guardians. We had bought humanity more time, perhaps another century or more before the next crisis would require additional reinforcements. I settled into my new existence, consciousness expanding to encompass duties and responsibilities that spanned dimensions. The man I had been was gone, but what I had become was infinitely more important. I was a guardian of reality itself, a a sentinel standing watch against the dark, and in the depths of Cell 7, surrounded by the bones of the ancient church above, and the living stone that pulsed with protective power, I began my eternal vigil. The work was everything now. The watch never ended. And in service to something greater than any individual life, I had found a purpose that transcended human understanding. The Vatican had built a prison for fallen angels, but the truth was far more complex and beautiful than that simple description suggested. They had built a fortress against the end of everything, and filled it with willing souls brave enough to sacrifice their humanity for the sake of all existence. I was one of those souls now, brother to angels and demons alike, guardian of barriers that kept the universe from unraveling, sentinel in a war that would continue until the stars themselves burned out. My name was Dominic Grae. I was the 47th Warden of Il Cavo. Now I am Raguel, and I will be the last Warden, because I will never leave my post. The cycle ends with me, but the watch continues forever. Somewhere above, a new letter is being written. Red wax is being heated for a seal. Another facility needs a guardian, another barrier requires reinforcement. The war continues on multiple fronts, and heroes are needed in dark places where light has never shone. The hollow is patient, the hollow endures, and now I'm part of the hollow, standing eternal guard against the forces that would unmake everything good and pure in creation. This is my story. This is my choice. This is my destiny. And when the stars fall and the universe grows cold, when all mortal things have passed into memory and time itself begins to fray, we will still be here. The guardians, the watchers, the willing souls who gave up everything to ensure that something would survive. Forever.